Rose and Derren stepped through the shimmering veil of the portal and into the bustling streets of Concordia. The air smelled of spice, ozone, and the ever-present pulse of magic woven through the city's veins. The architecture was a strange mix of old-world charm and arcane innovation. Floating lanterns lit cobblestone streets, while glowing sigils pulsed across stone facades, marking buildings of power and influence. But something was off. Rose felt it immediately, like a static charge under her skin. The usual ebb and flow of Concordia's portal network, dozens, sometimes hundreds of tiny rifts, shimmering at once, was missing. She glanced around, taking in the heavy presence of armoured enforcers patrolling key intersections. Her gaze followed the glowing sigils along the buildings. Except now they weren't just markers. They were seals. "Draven's been busy," she muttered. Derren adjusted the sling on Thunderstrike, his sharp gaze scanning the crowd. "I take it this isn't normal?" "No," Rose said, frowning. "Concordia's always been a free-flow trade city. You don't control portals here, not unless you want a war. But Draven's done it. He's sealed them." They walked further into the city, slipping through the throngs of merchants, mages, and weary travellers. The portal stations, once the lifeblood of Concordia, now stood empty, their gates dark and inactive. The usual hum of transport magic was gone, replaced by the heavy weight of control. She pulled Derren into a shadowed alcove and lowered her voice. "The portals that are still open? They're controlled." "Controlled how?" Derren's expression hardened. "By him," Rose said, nodding to a set of armoured enforcers standing watch at one of the few active stations. Black Dawn sigils gleamed across their chest plates. "Draven's locked down Concordia. No one comes in or out unless it benefits him." Derren exhaled through his nose. "And let me guess. If he controls all the portals, that means no one moves goods, information, or people without his say-so," Rose confirmed. "Which means if we want to get to the crystal, we're going to need another way." Derren frowned. "I thought you had backup here." Rose hesitated. "I might." He arched a brow. "You might?" Rose exhaled, rolling her shoulders. "There's an organization here, Night Whispers. I worked with them when I was last in Concordia. They're discreet, they deal in information, and most importantly, they control the only portals Draven doesn't." Derren grunted. "Let me guess, you burned that bridge?" Rose smirked. "I torched it, but business is business. If they're still running their private network, they'll want a favor in return, and I know exactly where to find them." Derren sighed. "Yeah, this is going to go great," she grinned. "That's the spirit." With that, Rose led him into the heart of Concordia, toward the one place Draven hadn't conquered. Yet, the city of Concordia pulsed with life, its streets teeming with merchants, travellers, and those who thrived in the shadows. The towering structures of polished stone and enchanted glass reflected the amber glow of the ever-burning lanterns, while bridges of woven magic arched gracefully between the buildings. It was a city of trade, of secrets, and of power plays that never ceased. Rose took in the sight with a deep breath, the weight of familiarity pressing down on her. It had been 8 years since she'd last stepped foot in Concordia, but it still carried the same scent of damp stone, burning incense, and the subtle tang of portal magic in the air. Beside her, Derren adjusted the strap of Thunderstrike, scanning their surroundings. His tactical instincts kicked in immediately. Too many eyes on them, too many unknowns. He could feel the tension in the air, the barely veiled dangers lurking beneath Concordia's polished surface. Rose exhaled sharply. "Draven's been busy." She gestured toward the city skyline. "Used to be a dozen portals in this district alone, easy access for traders and smugglers alike." Her fingers twitched as she pointed at the most notable locations. "Now, all but a handful are gone or locked down. The only ones still operating outside his control are mine, the ones I built with the House of Night Whispers." Derren crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. "So, what's the move?" You gonna go knock on their door? Or are we doing this the hard way? Rose snorted. You are the hard way. Damn right, he smirked. But come on, you're not exactly the popular girl here, are you? 8 years is a long time. What makes you think they'll even talk to you? Rose didn't answer immediately. Instead, she scanned the passing crowds, her mind already sifting through names and connections. The House of Night Whispers wasn't just an information network. It was an empire of shadows, one that she had carefully woven herself into years ago. She had burned that bridge when she fled Concordia. Now she needed to see if there were still embers left to rekindle. Only one way to find out, she muttered, adjusting her coat. Come on, I know where to start. Derren fell into step beside her as they moved through the winding streets, slipping into the underbelly of the city. The grand marketplace gave way to tighter corridors, damp stone alleyways, and flickering lanterns that barely kept the darkness at bay. The further they went, the quieter it became. At last, Rose stopped in front of a nondescript door built into a weathered brick wall. There was no sign, no indication that this was anything more than an abandoned structure. But she knew better. Derren raised a brow. We knocking, or do you have a secret handshake? Rose pulled out a small silver token from her pocket, an old marker of the House of Night Whispers, and placed it into a concealed slot in the doorframe. There was a click, followed by the faint shimmer of a magical scan running over her. Then, the door creaked open. A pair of sharp golden eyes met hers from the shadows within. A tall, robed figure stepped forward, their voice a quiet hum of amusement. Rose, they purred. We were wondering when you'd come crawling back. Derren muttered under his breath. Yeah, this is going to be fun. Rose smirked. You have no idea. The robed figure stepped forward, their golden eyes gleaming in the dim candlelight of the hidden entryway. The air inside smelled of ink, aged parchment, and something faintly metallic, magic woven into the very walls. Rose crossed her arms, tilting her head as she met the figure's gaze. Still dramatic, I see. The figure chuckled, a low, velvety sound. And you're still reckless, I see. Their gaze flicked to Derren, scanning him up and down with a slow, deliberate amusement. And you've brought a new toy. Derren exhaled through his nose. Oh yeah, this is going to be a blast. The figure ignored him, stepping back into the shadows. Come inside. If the house wanted you dead, you'd be bleeding in the street already. Comforting, Derren muttered, shooting Rose a look. She smirked. Come on, try not to insult anyone important. They stepped inside, the door sealing shut behind them with a soft click. The hallway beyond was narrow, leading into a grand chamber filled with flickering lanterns and bookshelves that stretched up into the darkness above. Hooded figures moved silently between them, their faces hidden behind smooth silver masks. Derren kept his steps light, his eyes sweeping over the room, cataloguing exits, cover points, and potential threats. He could feel it. This place was ancient, filled with whispers of old magic and older grudges. The golden-eyed figure strode ahead, leading them toward a circular table at the center of the chamber. Behind it, seated like a king on a throne of old tomes, was a figure Derren didn't recognize. But Rose clearly did. She stopped a few feet away, her smirk fading into something sharper. Lucien. The man lounging in the chair looked up, his violet eyes gleaming with amusement. He was dressed in midnight-coloured robes, his dark hair swept back, revealing the delicate silver markings tattooed along his jawline, a mark of the house's inner circle. Rose, Lucien said, resting his chin on his hand, you look surprisingly alive. Sorry to disappoint. Lucien's smile was slow, predatory. Oh, I wouldn't say I'm disappointed. Just surprised. You burned a lot of bridges last time you were here. Rose shrugged, her posture casual, but Derren caught the slight tension in her fingers. Bridges can be rebuilt, if the price is right. Lucien leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled as he studied Rose. The casual amusement in his eyes didn't quite reach the rest of his face. He was calculating, assessing. He knew she wouldn't be here unless she needed something, and Lucienne had always been good at making people pay for their needs. "The Hall of Silver Mirrors," he murmured, rolling the words over his tongue as if savouring their weight. "That's a dangerous place to be poking around these days." Rose smirked, feigning ease. "Dangerous? I remember it being a place of order, of power." Lucien chuckled, shaking his head. "That was before Lady Vess sold you out, before Draven fixed the network and took it from her." Rose's expression didn't waver, but inside, she was cursing. She had expected security, expected trouble, but Draven fully controlling the portals meant time was against her. Derren shifted beside her, arms crossed, his keen gaze flicking between them. He was listening. Always listening. Rose knew he'd smell a rat the second one showed up. "What changed?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. Lucienne shrugged. "Vess tried to save herself. She thought selling you out would keep her in control. Draven had other ideas. He let her think she was safe, then took the whole damn network for himself." Rose fought to keep her expression blank. They didn't know. They couldn't know. The Fireheart crystal was her secret. But if Draven's people were searching, it meant they suspected something was there. "I need to get inside," Rose said flatly, "and I need to get out clean." Lucien smirked, drumming his fingers against the table. "That's a tall order, darling." Rose's smirk matched his. "Then it's a good thing I have leverage." Lucien raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The hidden portals," Rose said smoothly. "The ones Draven doesn't know about. The ones I built." Lucian's amusement flickered, replaced by something sharper, more serious. "Go on." "If you help me, you keep your access. Draven doesn't touch your roots, your safe houses. I don't let him find what he's missing." Lucien exhaled, staring at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, shaking his head. "You always were good at negotiations." Derren finally spoke, voice low. "And what's stopping you from helping Draven instead?" Lucien turned his golden gaze to Derren, eyes narrowing slightly. "Because we don't take orders from warlords." Derren snorted. "Everyone takes orders from someone. Question is, who's giving yours?" The air shifted, subtle, but Rose felt it. A tension, a hesitation. Lucien wasn't rattled, but he wasn't as confident as he wanted them to believe. Rose leaned forward. "I don't have time for games, Lucien. You know the house isn't untouchable, no matter how much you like to pretend it is. Draven's pressing in. If you help me, you keep your network, and you keep me owing you a favour. If you don't..." She let the words hang. Lucien studied her for a long moment before sighing dramatically. "Fine. You'll get your information." "And if things go sideways?" Rose smiled coldly. "That's why I need you for the exit." Lucien smirked, shaking his head. "Oh, Rose, you're going to make such a mess, aren't you?" She stood. "Only if they make me." Lucien gestured to one of the masked figures lingering nearby. "Get her the details quietly." Rose turned to Derren. "Looks like we have a plan." Derren exhaled, watching Lucien carefully. "Yeah, let's just hope we don't regret it." The night air was thick with the scent of damp stone and incense as Rose led Derren through Concordia's twisting back streets. They walked in silence, navigating the city's underbelly with an ease that spoke to Rose's past familiarity. Eventually they reached an unassuming wooden door at the base of a worn, weathered building. Rose knocked 3 times in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The door creaked open just enough for a pair of watchful eyes to peer through. A sharp intake of breath followed. "Mistress Rose?" Rose allowed herself a small smile. "Hello, old friend." The door swung open fully, revealing a middle-aged man in modest robes. His dark hair was streaked with silver, his sharp features hardened with age, but still familiar. Jiro had once been Master Chen's quiet shadow, the ever-present servant in the background. Now he stood alone, the sole keeper of this place. "You were here," Jiro said, eyes flickering with recognition. "When he passed?" Rose nodded. "I was." Jiro hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside. "Then you already know. He left everything to me." Derren took in the sparse yet well-kept interior. The scent of old parchment and dried herbs filled the air. "Cozy," he muttered. Jiro eyed him but said nothing, moving to light a lantern. "The guest chamber remains as it was, Rose. You will find it upstairs." Rose nodded. "Thank you, Jiro." Derren followed her up the narrow staircase and into a small but warm room. A single bed sat against the far wall, with soft lantern light casting shadows over the wooden floor. The realization struck at the same time for both of them. "One bed," Derren remarked, leaning against the doorframe with a smirk. "Cozy indeed." Rose rolled her eyes. "You're sleeping on the floor?" Derren placed a hand over his heart in mock offense. "You wound me." "You'll live," Rose shot back, pulling off her boots. "Unlike you, I need my rest." Derren smirked as he leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Oh, I rest just fine. It's the sharing a room with an evil mastermind part that makes it tricky." Rose snorted. "Please, if I wanted you dead, I'd have let Draven deal with you back in the brownstone." Derren smirked. "Touching. So, how do we do this? I take the floor, you take the bed?" "Obviously." "Yeah, see, I have this bad back." "Derren. And you wouldn't want me to be injured before the big job." Rose threw a pillow at him. "Floor. Now." Derren caught it easily, laughing. All right, don't get all stabby." Later in the night, Derren stirred. The floor was hard, cold, and entirely beneath him. Unacceptable. Half asleep, he rolled onto his feet, stretching before silently slipping onto the far edge of the bed. Rose, barely conscious, grumbled. "If you snore, you die." Derren smirked but didn't push his luck. Noted. By morning the bed was empty. Derren woke with a start, blinking at the absence of warmth beside him. He sat up, glancing around the room. Rose was gone. His gut tightened. She wouldn't just leave. He found her downstairs in Master Chen's old office, fingers trailing over the spines of old ledgers. Her expression was distant, unreadable. Derren leaned against the doorframe. "You planning on running off without me, or just reminiscing?" Rose didn't turn, her fingers pausing on one book in particular. She opened it carefully, eyes scanning the delicate ink strokes of Chen's handwriting. "Just remembering," she murmured. But there was something more to it. Derren stepped closer, watching her. He could see it now, the way her posture had shifted, the slight crease in her brow. She wasn't just reading, she was absorbing. Chen's notes weren't just records, they were philosophies, his thoughts on power, deception, patience. Lessons Rose had once embraced but had long since abandoned in favor of brute survival. She turned a page, running her fingers along the margins where Chen had written in tiny, precise script. "Power is not in dominance, but in control. Those who fight with strength alone are bound to be outmatched. The one who sees the field before the battle begins has already won." Rose exhaled slowly. She had been fighting for so long, relying on instinct and brute force. She had forgotten this side of herself, the side that saw the long game. Derren, watching, crossed his arms. "That actually making sense to you, or should I be worried?" She closed the book with a small, knowing smirk. "You should always be worried," Derren chuckled. "That's what I was afraid of." For the first time in a long time, Rose wasn't just reacting to the fight ahead, she was planning for it. The smell of warm spices and fresh bread filled the air as they stepped into the dining area. Jiro had prepared a simple but rich breakfast: steamed rice, roasted meats, pickled vegetables, and tea that smelled of jasmine and something Rose couldn't quite place. She hesitated, the familiarity of it striking a note she hadn't expected. It had been years since she'd sat at this table. Jiro gestured for them to sit. "Eat. You'll need your strength." Derren didn't hesitate, grabbing a plate and digging in with enthusiasm. "All right, I'll say it. This beats ration bars." Rose shot him a look but picked up her chopsticks anyway. The first bite was almost startling, the taste transporting her back to a time before everything had become about survival. For a moment, she wasn't the fire-wielding strategist fighting to stay ahead of Draven. She was just Rose, Master Chen's student, sharing a meal in a place that once felt like home. Derren studied her between bites, noticing the shift in her expression. He didn't comment, but the look in his eyes said he saw it. Jiro poured tea into a small ceramic cup and placed it in front of Rose. "You've changed." Rose arched a brow. "Time does that." Jiro nodded. "Perhaps, but some things should not be forgotten." His gaze flicked to the book she had taken from the office, then back to her. Master Chen would have said the same. Rose wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her skin. He had a lot to say. Jiro smiled faintly. "And you were the only one stubborn enough to argue with him." Derren smirked. "That tracks." Rose ignored him, taking a sip of her tea. The warmth settled something inside her, grounding her in a way she hadn't realized she needed. "We should go soon." Jiro nodded. "Be careful, Mistress Rose." Derren wiped his mouth and stood. "Careful's not exactly our style." Rose set her cup down, standing as well. The brief moment of peace was over. It was time to move. But instead of heading straight for the Hall of Silver Mirrors, Rose led them outside into Master Chen's garden. The space had once been vibrant, filled with delicate koi ponds, shaped trees, and the scent of blossoms in the air. Now it was quieter, more worn with time but still standing. Jiro had cared for it well. She stepped toward the small shrine near the pond, where incense sticks rested in an old brass holder. Without a word, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small silver charm, a token she had carried for years, one that had once belonged to Master Chen. She placed it beside the incense and knelt, bowing her head for a long, silent moment. Derren watched from a respectful distance, arms crossed but his usual sarcasm absent. He didn't understand all of Rose's past, but he could tell this wasn't just a ritual. It was a moment of truth for her. After a few moments, Rose exhaled and stood, brushing off her knees. She glanced at Derren. "All right, now we go." Derren raised a brow. "You good?" Rose smirked faintly. "I'm better." Jiro, standing in the doorway, gave a small nod of approval. Master Chen would have been proud. Rose didn't reply, but something in her eyes softened before she turned away, leading Derren toward the mission ahead. The fight was coming, but for the first time in a long time, Rose felt ready. The Hall of Silver Mirrors loomed ahead, its once grand entrance now shadowed beneath the cold glow of Concordia's sky. The mirrored panels that had once reflected the elegance of the city were now tarnished, cracked in places, some deliberately darkened to prevent easy surveillance. This was no longer a place of prestige. It was Draven's hub. Rose and Derren moved carefully through the streets, keeping to the edges, avoiding the wandering patrols. The hall wasn't overrun with guards, but it had just enough of a presence to keep ordinary people away. "This is too easy," Derren muttered as they reached a side alley near one of the old maintenance entrances. Rose's lips pressed into a thin line. "Feels like a trap." But she didn't stop. Hesitation got people killed. She knelt by the access panel, fingers gliding over the old security scanner. This was her system, her old network. The framework was still in place, but someone had added redundancies. Extra layers of clearance beyond what should be necessary. "Cute," she murmured, reaching into her belt and retrieving a slim silver device. She slid it into the panel's hidden port and tapped the controls. The system flickered, old authorization codes wrestling with new overrides. A second too long. A low beep sounded, a proximity alert. Derren shifted. "We got company." Rose barely looked up. "Stall them." Derren let out a breath and turned as a pair of security personnel rounded the corner. They weren't hardened soldiers, just mercenary types, bored but competent enough to recognize when something was off. "You're not supposed to be here," one of them said, hand hovering near his belt. Derren put on his most irritatingly confident grin. "Oh, you know how it is. Places to be, doors to open, secrets to steal. The usual." The second guard narrowed his eyes. "Identify yourself." "Uh-huh, sure. I'm—" Derren's fist shot out, cracking the first guard across the jaw before he could reach for his weapon. The second barely had time to react before Derren grabbed his collar and yanked him forward, slamming his head into the metal panel beside them. Both guards dropped. Rose's device beeped softly. The panel flickered green. "You done?" she asked dryly. Derren shook out his fist. "You know, you could have let me finish my line. I had something good." Rose didn't dignify that with a response. Instead, she opened the access door and slipped inside, Derren close behind. The air inside was thick, stale, like a place too lived in but never truly inhabited. Rose walked with confidence, but every step sent unease curling in her gut. The grandeur was still here, but it had soured. The walls bore the same intricate carvings, the floors still held the faint luster of polished stone, but the details were wrong. Too clean in some places, too neglected in others. Derren's fingers twitched near his weapon. "You feel that?" "Yeah," Rose murmured. "It's watching us." The hall wasn't just occupied, it was aware. She took them through the quieter paths, old servant corridors, passages only she would remember. The ones never meant for guests, for important people. They were the veins of the hall, once filled with quiet movements, workers who passed unseen. Now they were hollow. Their footsteps echoed. Too loud, at a turn a shadow flickered. A figure moving just out of sight. Derren stiffened. Rose pretended not to notice. If they were being followed, no need to tip their hand yet. She kept moving, reaching another security panel near the west wing, a direct path toward her office. The panel was new, sleek, modern, not hers. "Not going to be as easy this time," she muttered, kneeling beside it. "Give me a sec." Derren's eyes stayed on the darkened halls behind them. He didn't like this. "Make it quick." Rose worked fast, pulling a thin wire from her sleeve, feeding it into the panel's side. A bypass, not perfect, but quick enough. The screen flickered, and she entered an old override code. The lock clicked. A breath of relief. She rose to her feet. A shuffling sound 2 halls over, too careful to be random movement. They weren't alone. Derren turned his head slightly. "Still think we're walking into a trap?" Rose gave a wry smirk. "Oh, I know we are." She pushed the door open, stepping inside, and Derren followed, scanning the space. Ahead of them, down the dim corridor, was the heavy wooden door to her old office. It stood slightly ajar, waiting. A chill crawled up Rose's spine. Something was very, very wrong. Rose took a slow step forward, eyes locked on the door to her old office. She knew this room, every inch of it, but now it felt foreign, as if someone had worn her skin and tried to live in it, but hadn't gotten it quite right. Derren pressed his back against the wall beside the door, giving her a look. "On 3?" She nodded, pulse steady despite the weight settling in her chest. 1, 2. Rose exhaled and reached for the handle, turning it silently before slipping inside. Derren followed, closing the door just as quietly behind them. The office was still. Rose took in the room with a careful, measured gaze. The furniture was mostly as she had left it. The heavy wooden desk, the scattered notes pinned along the wall, the workbench covered in fine tools. A thin layer of dust settled over most surfaces, except for one key difference: the storage cabinets. Those were new. Her fingers ghosted over the desk, scanning for anything out of place. The weight of familiarity pressed against her, tangled with unease. If Draven's people had been in here, why hadn't they stripped the room? Why leave her things untouched? Derren moved toward the cabinets, eyes flicking between them. "I'll check these," he murmured, voice low. "You do your thing." Rose nodded, already kneeling beside the desk. Her hands moved swiftly, pressing against a series of hidden grooves beneath the wood. The trick was muscle memory, an old habit trained into her by necessity. She felt for the right panel, fingers brushing against the barely there seam in the floorboards. A sharp push, a twist of the wrist, and a faint click echoed. A shimmer flared as the pocket realm reacted to her touch, a dim ripple in the air forming along the wall next to the desk. Her gaze flicked to her old workbench where her set of delicate tools lay untouched, exactly where she had left them. That alone sent a ripple of unease through her. Draven's people had ransacked so many places. Yet they had left this alone. That meant either they hadn't found it, or they were waiting for her to. She reached for a slender needle-like instrument from the kit and knelt beside the wall. Her fingers found the tiny, near-invisible seam where the pocket portal was hidden. With precise, practiced movements, she inserted the tool and twisted gently. The wall shimmered, the stone appearing to ripple like disturbed water. The moment stretched impossibly long before the enchanted surface gave way, revealing the small portal she had left behind. Heat rolled out, pulsing like a living thing. The Fireheart crystal lay inside, its molten glow casting flickering red and gold patterns on the walls. Rose exhaled, steadying herself. It had been waiting for her. She worked quickly, reaching into the void, fingers stretching through the enchanted barrier. The heat met her first, a familiar pulse against her skin. Then her fingers brushed the smooth surface of the Fireheart crystal. Rose's breath hitched as she grasped it fully, feeling the fire within hum in response. Across the room, Derren cracked open one of the storage crates. His brows furrowed as he rifled through the documents inside. "Rose," he said, sharper this time. She turned her head just as he lifted a file, flipping it open to reveal rows of names, locations, shipments. Black Dawn wasn't just in murk dust. They were operating across multiple realms. Experiments, augmentations, something bigger than just weapons manufacturing. Rose tucked the crystal into a secure pouch, rising to her feet. "We need to move." Derren grabbed a handful of files, stuffing them into his coat before slinging Thunderstrike off his shoulder, keeping it low but ready. The weight of the enchanted 12-gauge in his grip was a comfort. He had a feeling he was going to need it soon. Yeah, because this just became a hell of a lot bigger than we thought. Rose slung the pouch carrying the Fireheart crystal securely at her side, feeling the heat seeping through the fabric, coiling up her arm like a whisper of power waiting to be called. She flexed her fingers, already sensing the difference. The control, the amplification, the raw energy now coursing through her veins. She didn't just feel powerful, she felt precise. Derren moved to the door first, stepping to the side as Rose eased it open. And there, waiting in the dim corridor, stood Lady Vess. A smug smile curled her painted lips, dark eyes glittering with amusement. Behind her, blocking the exit, stood 4 of Draven's elites, battle-hardened, armoured, and armed to the teeth. "Rose," Vess purred. "I was beginning to think you'd never come home." Rose's jaw tightened. "Vess, I'd say it's good to see you, but I try not to lie more than necessary." Derren, standing just behind Rose, caught sight of the elites shifting subtly, preparing to move. He didn't hesitate. Thunderstrike came up in an instant, his first shot punching a storm of enchanted buckshot into the nearest elite at point-blank range. The man barely made a sound, just a violent crack as his body was thrown back against the wall, armor useless against the sheer force of the impact. The air filled with the scent of burning fabric and blood. The other elites reacted instantly, too late. Derren had already shifted, cycling Thunderstrike's next round. The second elite barely had time to register the movement before a 2-ounce enchanted slug turned his chest into a ruin, the force throwing him backwards like a ragdoll, shattering ribs, piercing armor like paper. Rose, already supercharged with the Fireheart crystal's energy, flicked her wrist. A burst of heat erupted from her palm, the fire surging outward in a tight, controlled blast. The last elite made the mistake of raising his weapon at Rose. She didn't even hesitate, her fingers flexed, and with a sharp twist of her wrist, fire wrapped around his throat like a serpent, squeezing and searing in a single motion. He tried to scream, but there was no air left to do it with. Within seconds, he collapsed into a charred husk. His scream cut short as he collapsed in a heap of charred metal and flesh. And Lady Vess. Lady Vess was staggering back, her face pale, her breath unsteady. She barely had time to register Rose moving before a fist connected hard with her jaw, snapping her head to the side. The explosion of fire and gunfire had sent heat licking at her skin, and the acrid stench of burning flesh filled the corridor. Her carefully composed facade cracked just for a second before she masked it with a sharp inhale, eyes flicking to the ruined remains of her guards. Rose took a slow step forward, the fire dancing in her palm, not wild, but precise, controlled, a direct contrast to the storm of chaos that had just erupted around them. Vess's throat bobbed, her confidence faltering, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, a forced smirk tugging at her lips, as if to pretend she still had control over this situation. "You betrayed me," Rose said, voice low and steady. "I haven't forgotten." The blaring of security sirens shattered the lingering silence of the corridor. Red emergency lights pulsed along the walls, casting erratic shadows that made the scene even more chaotic. Derren didn't waste a second. He shoved Rose forward, gripping Lady Vess by the arm and dragging her along as he pushed toward the nearest exit. She struggled, dazed from the punch, but he tightened his grip, shoving her toward Rose as they moved. "Here," he barked. "You watch her. I'll clear the way." Rose caught Vess by the collar, keeping a tight hold on her as Derren surged ahead, Thunderstrike already reloading in practiced fluid motions. Click, shell in, click, shell in. The weight of the shotgun was solid in his hands, the alternating enchanted rounds promising devastation to whatever came next. They didn't have time for finesse anymore. More boots pounded down the hall. Reinforcements. Rose tightened her grip on Lady Vess, the heat of the Fireheart crystal thrumming at her side. She could feel it, waiting, eager to be used. Derren pressed forward, jaw tight. "We need to be out of here now." The exit was close, but so was the fight. They had seconds before the next wave hit. A trooper rounded the corner at full speed, weapon raised. Derren reacted instantly. He lunged forward, using Thunderstrike like a battering ram. The butt of the shotgun smashed into the trooper's face with a sickening crack, sending him sprawling backward. Blood sprayed against the wall as the man hit the ground hard, his weapon skidding across the floor. Derren didn't even pause. He grabbed the nearest cover point and kept moving, scanning ahead as more movement flickered at the edges of the corridor. "Move, move!" he snapped, pushing Rose ahead as she dragged Lady Vess along. Rose didn't need to be told twice. She kept her grip firm on Vess, her mind racing through the fastest way out. The crystal's energy buzzed under her skin, making her faster, sharper, her reflexes heightened in a way she hadn't felt in years. Up ahead, a security door loomed, their only exit before the lockdown sealed them inside. Derren, jaw set. "That door open? Or am I blowing it down?" Rose gritted her teeth. "Give me a second." "You've got 3. The pounding boots behind them were getting closer. 3 seconds was all she needed. Rose shoved Lady Vess against the wall, keeping her in place with a firm grip as she tore open the security panel beside the door. Her fingers moved fast, grabbing a slim tool from her belt and jamming it into the wiring, overriding the lock manually. Sparks flickered as the system resisted her input. Derren pivoted, raising Thunderstrike as another pair of troopers burst into view at the far end of the hall. He fired. The first shot, enchanted 0-0 buckshot, shredded through the first trooper's armor, sending him crashing against the wall in a spray of blood and torn plating. The second, smarter than his partner, hit the ground and rolled into cover, firing wildly down the corridor. Energy sparked off the walls, forcing Derren to duck. "Rose!" "Almost there," she snapped, fingers twisting the last circuit into place. The second trooper leaned out, raising his weapon for another shot. Rose didn't let him. She flicked her fingers toward him, and a controlled burst of white-hot flame shot down the hall, engulfing him before he could scream. His armor glowed red-hot as he writhed, collapsing to the floor in a smouldering heap. The security panel let out a sharp beep. Unlocked, Rose yanked the door open. "Go!" Derren didn't hesitate, grabbing Vess by the arm and hauling her through the threshold. Rose followed, slamming the door shut behind them just as more shouts echoed from behind. They were in the final corridor now, mere yards from the outer exit. But they weren't out yet. The hallway stretched before them, too open for comfort. If reinforcements flanked them now, they'd be trapped. The sound of shouting echoed behind them, boots pounding against the floor, closing in fast. Derren didn't slow. He shoved forward, dragging Lady Vess as Rose kept pace beside him. The Fireheart crystal thrummed at her side, its power whispering, urging her to let it loose. Up ahead, the final security checkpoint loomed, a reinforced barrier standing between them and the open air. A single guard was stationed near the panel, his eyes going wide as he registered the situation. He moved for his weapon. Derren was faster. The shotgun roared, a 2-ounce enchanted slug obliterating the console and punching through the guard's chest, sending him crashing into the wall. The barrier lock shorted out, sparks flying as the metal doors groaned slightly ajar. "Go, go!" Derren barked, shifting his grip on Lady Vess as he forced the doors open further. Rose turned, just as the first of the pursuit came through the previous door. Her fingers twitched. A wall of fire erupted in the doorway, cutting off their pursuers in a blast of heat and light. Shouts of alarm rang out behind the flames, but they wouldn't hold for long. Vess thrashed in Derren's grip, half-dazed but still stubborn. "You don't know what you're doing," she hissed at Rose. Rose yanked her forward with a smirk. "I never do. That's what makes it fun." With one last shove, they burst through the exit and into the Concordian night, the air crisp and dangerously free. But the city wasn't safe yet. They still had to disappear. Rose didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lady Vess's wrist and pulled her hard into the nearest alley, Derren keeping his shotgun raised and scanning the rooftops for potential snipers. The sirens behind them blared louder, echoing through the streets as security forces scrambled to contain the chaos. "This way!" Rose hissed, leading him through a maze of tight corridors between buildings where the shadows were deep and the air smelled of rain-soaked stone. They weaved past crates, old storage units, and rusted pipes, their boots slapping against the damp ground. Ahead, hidden in the deepest stretch of the alley, a faint blue shimmer rippled in the air, the escape portal to Atherin. Rose didn't slow. She tightened her grip on Lady Vess, practically dragging her toward the glowing gateway. "Get ready, it's not going to stay open forever." Derren pivoted, turning his back to the portal as he raised Thunderstrike, scanning their six. They weren't out of this yet. Heavy boots pounded closer. Security forces had picked up their trail. "Move it, Rose," Derren snapped. With a final shove, they plunged into the portal, leaving Concordia's chaos behind. The transition through the portal was seamless, but the moment they stepped out onto Atherin's soil, the weight of the realm settled over them. The sky above was cast in perpetual twilight, painting the world in hues of deep violet and gold. The air smelled of damp earth, ancient magic, and the lingering traces of something darker, a reminder of the corruption that still scarred this land. Around them, the land shifted from ashen wastelands to dense forests, signs of both destruction and renewal in the wake of the Demon King's fall. Derren scanned the horizon, keeping Thunderstrike at the ready. "Well, this place is just full of charm." Rose barely acknowledged him, her attention on Lady Vess, who had landed hard on the uneven stone beneath them. The woman lifted her head, eyes flicking across their surroundings with calculated wariness. Atherin wasn't just another stop, she knew what this place meant. Rose grabbed her by the arm and pulled her to her feet. On your feet. We're not done. Derren wasted no time. He pulled out his communicator and pressed a secure channel to Lysandra. We're back. Let Gunnar know and tell Eliana to open the portal to the workshop. We'll be there soon. A crackle of magic buzzed through the device before Lysandra's voice came through, steady and composed. Understood. I'll notify them immediately. The portal will be ready. Be quick. Atherin is no place to linger. Derren smirked, glancing around at the eerie twilight landscape. Yeah, no argument there. Meanwhile, Rose wasn't waiting. She shoved Lady Vess down onto a jagged stone slab, her grip tight as the fire of the Fireheart crystal flared along her arm. Heat pulsed in the air between them, making Vess flinch despite herself. You and I have unfinished business, Rose said, voice low and sharp. I'd ask if you wanted to do this the easy way, but I know you too well for that. Lady Vess exhaled slowly, shaking off the lingering daze from their escape. Torture isn't exactly your style, Rose. You wouldn't risk ruining that little moral line you like to dance on. Rose leaned in, the firelight casting dangerous shadows across her face. You don't know me as well as you think you do. Derren checked his weapon, keeping one eye on the tree line and the other on the interrogation. He didn't interrupt. This was Rose's moment. But this wasn't just about payback anymore. Draven had attacked Echo Division. He had taken Argos. The thought made her blood burn hotter than the flames licking at her fingertips. She had been fighting to get ahead of Draven's game, but he had still managed to strike first. Vess knew things that could lead Rose straight to Argos, straight to Draven's weaknesses. For days she had been trying to breach Draven's network, attempting every trick she knew. But nothing worked. His control over the portal system was too tight, his defenses too well placed. But now, with the Fireheart crystal fused to the portal crystal, she finally had the means to break through. She could hack into his system directly, override his controls, and find Argos. And if Lady Vess knew anything that could make that easier, she'd be giving it up, whether she liked it or not. Lady Vess lifted her chin, her smugness still intact. Then go ahead. Let's see if you've changed as much as you claim. Rose smiled, slow and razor-sharp. Oh, you'll see. Trust me. And when you start talking, I suggest you choose your words carefully. Behind them, the portal flared to life, a bright shimmer of energy slicing through the twilight air. A deep, familiar voice cut through the crackling magic. Derren, Rose? Status? Gunnar's tone was sharp, all business. Derren turned, still gripping Thunderstrike as he stepped closer to the portal. We're coming through. Me, Rose, and a drag-along. He glanced over at Lady Vess, smirking. Try to guess who. There was a brief pause before Gunnar responded. Copy that? Eliana's holding the portal open. Move fast. Derren looked over his shoulder at Rose. Time to go.